Let me tell you a bit about my favourite Codemasters game. Now, I've been pretty knee-deep in their work lately, what with working on a big video about them. So many games, everything from PS1 classics to the lowest of the low-budget titles. You know, the ones described as absolutely brilliant when they're quite clearly not. The professional something simulator gubbins. They have quite the range. But the story of Codemasters is an interesting one. In many ways, it's a journey towards credibility, from a commercially very successful budget publisher that was still mostly roundly criticised and mocked for their practices, to a much more serious studio producing, for the most part, quality work. Fantastic Dizzy was, in many ways, a turning point for the studio, in ways that were quite destabilising, but ways that also set them up for the future. And while I'm working on a big old video that will cover all this and more, Fantastic Dizzy as a game and a story is worth a bit of coverage on its own. The background to Fantastic Dizzy is quite simple. It was to be the 7th and to date biggest by far entry in Codemasters' flagship series, the almighty Dizzy. The legendary rolling egg was an icon of the late 80s in microcomputers, which is something that always seems to shock people who aren't in their mid-30s to 40s and from the United Kingdom. What? That silly looking egg? Really? But yes, these playful little puzzle platformers, available in Codemasters' budget range for £3 a pop, were very successful. Each main Dizzy title was more than capable of a few 100,000 sold across all the usual formats: Spectrum, Amstrad, C64, Amiga. Were they always good? No. They could be unfair at times. Controlling an egg-shaped hero is not exactly intuitive. They're filled with silly collecting, and some of the puzzles require moon logic, usually to the point where you might need to contact the Codemasters helpline, which in the case of the first and worst game in the series, is literally displayed on the screen at all times. Presumably it must have been a bit of a money spinner due to all the kids who surely got their parents' permission before calling that 08 number. Still, Dizzy, like any series, has good and bad. Starts out poorly, ends up with some big highlights. Treasure Island Dizzy, Fantasy World Dizzy, Magic Land Dizzy. A class one indeed. A couple of the spin-offs are also great, especially Fast Food and Quick Snacks, on the Spectrum and Amstrad at least. And although Codemasters released a lot of games in these days, and a fair amount of them were trash, the Dizzy games came from Cody's pair of aces, Andrew and Philip Oliver, better known simply as the Oliver Twins, responsible for not just Dizzy but other big hits like Super Robin Hood, Professional Ski Simulator, Grand Prix Simulator, Advanced Pinball Simulator, basically most of the actually good simulator games, Ghost Hunters, Race Against Time. Lots of hits, enough for them to be credited with around 3 million sales all by themselves, that to be sniffed at back then, and even, according to 180's interview, 7% of all computer game sales in the UK. The Olivers were Codemasters' top dogs at the time, basically, as dependable as they came. Now, the amount of sales is good, although the actual profit was, of course, a bit limited by the fact that these were budget titles, a problem that Cody's were keen to resolve at the turn of the 90s by expanding and finally getting into the full price world, something that both the Olivers and the company's other pair of brothers, Richard and David Darlin, the founders, were rather keen to do, despite their reputation as a proud budget studio who had, indeed, often declared that big titles like Dizzy were never going to go full price. Looking back, if you believed that, you could have probably believed anything. Outside of the success in Europe, they did have a certain presence in other places, although not always a conventional one. Their offshoot company, Chimerica, released unlicensed games and other accessories for the NES over the pond, although they often had to face off against Nintendo in the courts. Now, even though Chimerica prevailed every time, that was still a nuisance. Here then, in 1990, there are the beginnings of a pull in different directions. The Olivers are keen to expand Dizzy further and further, while the Darlings are slowly beginning to look more towards things like racing and sports games and games that are a bit more grounded in reality, as opposed to fantastical platformers like Dizzy. Still, the Olivers spent 8 months making what would be their biggest and best Dizzy game. Fantastic Dizzy is the game that could and most certainly should have taken the egg to another level. In the mind of the twins, if they could harness the potential selling power of the NES with a game that cost 30 quid a pop instead of 3 quid, if they managed to reach 500,000 sales with that, well, that'd be bloody awesome. Millions of pounds. Alas, it didn't quite happen that way. Although Fantastic Dizzy didn't exactly do terribly or anything on the NES, selling around 150,000, getting a good critical reception and winning a couple of awards, it perhaps was not as big a success as was desired. One big reason for this perhaps is that while Fantastic Dizzy was finished and set for release in the summer of 1990, it was delayed heavily due to a protracted legal case between Nintendo and Comerica, again, over the latter's most famous accessory, that being the Game Genie. Codemasters prevailed once more, but the whole thing delayed the release of other games considerably. Fantastic Dizzy didn't come out on the NES until April of 1991, by which time the 16-bit era was pretty fully in swing. Weren't really looking too much at the NES anymore, were we? Another odd quirk of this delay is that minigames set to be included as part of Fantastic Dizzy actually got standalone releases on microcomputers and the like before the game including them came out. Bubble Dizzy and Dizzy Down the Rapids both found their way onto British computer shelves around 1990. Neither were particularly good. While Fantastic Dizzy was good enough to signal a big new step for the series, it was actually closer to the end for the egg. There was only one more game in the series after it, Crystal Kingdom Dizzy, which was a full price release on computers. While it did sell enough to get to the top of the charts again, it didn't set the world on fire and was critically blasted. Indeed, it's definitely one of the weaker Dizzy games. Not too long after this, the massive fiasco that was the Aladdin deck enhancer ended up bankrupting Comerica completely, and the relationship between Codemasters and the Oliver twins finally fizzled out due to disputes over games such as Wonderland Dizzy, Go Dizzy Go and Dreamworld Pogie that were set to come out for the deck enhancer. But the story behind Fantastic Dizzy doesn't actually end there. An enhanced 16-bit version came out in 1993 for the Amiga, PC and Sega Mega Drive. And it's this version that we're looking at, specifically the Mega Drive one, which was either available on its own or in a 2-for-1 cart with strange hybrid point-and-click platformer Cosmic Spacehead. No prizes for guessing which game's better. Hint, it's the one you're watching a video about right now. What makes up Fantastic Dizzy then? It's an odd one. On one hand, it's an all-in expansion on the things that make Dizzy, Dizzy. There's the collection aspect. Before the game's end, you're going to need to have collected 250 stars to open up the final barrier into Zack's Tower. A long way removed from the 30-odd trinkets you used to have in the other Dizzy games. Said stars can be found in virtually every screen of the game, and there's even some in the minigames too, which may well require you to go through those games more than once just to pick up every single star. There is no leniency here. Either you get all 250 stars, or you do not finish the game. Beyond Euro platformers that may demand you to get a certain percentage of crap before you can exit a level, there's not an awful lot of other 16-bit platformers that require you to get 100% of an item across the whole game in order to finish. But that's Dizzy written all over. The second big Dizzy thing is, of course, puzzles, generally of the item-based variety. You'll get a feel of this very quickly when working your way through the Yoke Folks treehouse complex at the beginning of the game, trying to solve the individual problems of your fellow eggs and getting all the elevators up and running. Most of these puzzles are helpfully self-contained in the complex, although there are a few that will take you outside of it and obviously near the end of the game, you'll be finding items that solve puzzles right on the opposite edge of the world to the actual solution, and there will be lots of backtracking. Most of the puzzles do make sense this time around, with only occasional jumps into Moon Logicville. However, the game is fiendish here in other ways by supplying the odd sneaky red herring. There are a couple of items that actually serve the same purpose, or items that only really help to shorten the distance you need to travel a little. An empty treasure chest could be pondered over for hours and shown to everyone in the hope that it does something, when all it is just something you can stand on, used as a means of looping from one end of the game's world to the other in a little callback to Treasure Island Dizzy. Hell, there's even the odd little area or object in the game that looks like it requires some sort of puzzling, when it's just there. The graveyard's full of that. It's quite easy to overthink in the game. But again, red herring items and the like are a big part of Dizzy. And of course, Dizzy himself doesn't exactly have deep pockets. He can only carry 3 items at once. This game is all about serious levels of item management, which you'll probably only learn through practice, at least trying to streamline the process and keeping items in a convenient place that's close to where you're eventually going to need them. With the amount of items, locations and puzzles in this game, it can be very easy to lose your thread and spend a chunk of time looking for an item that you've lost. It's not uncommon for the all-important key required to open up the game's final area to be found in a random bloody treehouse because you put it there 20 minutes ago and you completely lost track of where it was. This is exacerbated by Dizzy cycling through his items. You're constantly dropping stuff in and out of your pockets, making it easier to forget to pick something up again. The cruelest example of this, although easily avoidable in all honesty, involves accidentally dropping your oxygen tank when you're underwater and drowning immediately. It's funny, you know, Dizzy is pretty hearty for an egg, he's got an energy bar and all that, and he's even surprisingly capable of falling very long distances with nought but a scratch. He's clearly quite hard-boiled, but water will drown him just like that. At least, aside from the parts of the game where it doesn't. Again, it's just one of those annoying Dizzy trademarks at work. All of this probably sounds like a mixed bag to a lot of people at best. Fantastic Dizzy is a tough game, and also a long game with no chance of saving or using passwords or anything like that. Those 250 stars have to be collected in one sitting. Now there should perhaps be an asterisk there of sorts. The game, for a platformer, would certainly have been considered long for the time. The game can be completed in around 2 to 4 hours, so long as you don't end up screwing everything up. Nowadays, such a length might actually be more acceptable. You get 3 lives and no continues, although there are several opportunities to earn extra lives in the game through the completion of a pretty simple sliding puzzle. Good thing too, because attrition can be a bastard in the game. While enemies themselves aren't necessarily hard to avoid, taking bits of damage here and there can ultimately kill you, especially in some of the trickier places like the subways that link the various areas of the city of Keldor together. It can also be pretty easy to lose lives sharpish in the minigames, at least until you've actually learned them. Speaking of which, well, what are the minigames like? They can be pretty nasty from time to time, even if they are, on the whole, not bad. The minecart is certainly one of the most vicious. It only takes a little one turn in to send our poor egg crashing into a barrier or a troll, at which point he will crack and die instantly. And of course there's plenty of stars here, so you're certainly going to have to play the minigame more than once until you actually learn it. It can actually be a speedy way of getting around the world once you've got to grips with it. There's multiple exits dotted around all over the shop, but it is evil. Bubble Dizzy is a simpler game. Weirdly, Dizzy develops oxygen in this section, which might be galling to anyone who's dropped their oxygen tank in the depths and died immediately. Anywho, you ride the bubbles until they pop, make sure you collect the stars on the way, and get up to the surface before your air runs out. Not too hard, and to be honest, you should only need to do this once. The timer here in the Mega Drive version is a lot more forgiving than the one in the NES version, believe me. Speaking of which, the Dizzy Down the Rapids minigame from the NES was cut out completely for the Mega Drive version. Your only real reward for doing it was a barrel of rum for Pirate Blackheart, and, well, the game's not very good. It's no big loss, honestly. The other main minigame is Crazy Castles. Overpower a bunch of trolls defending a castle in the time limit with a crossbow. The timer is more dangerous than the trolls are, it has to be said. Even the final part of the game, Zack's Tower, is sort of a minigame, mainly because Dizzy does move in an altogether different and more deliberate way to deal with this last somewhat Metroid-esque platforming challenge. That can be a little bit weird to get used to. There is a technical side to the game that really does shine, to the point where it's by a long distance the one Dizzy game that I would recommend everyone to play first, way ahead of any other. It's a conventionally simple but very effective looking game with a hero that's actually quite personable and filled with different expressions. The music here on the Mega Drive version is wonderful, and the game is much easier to control than other Dizzy titles while still giving that eggy feeling. Dizzy may roll a bit if you jump him down the hill, but he won't roll absolutely everywhere like he often does in the earlier games. There's other things specific to the 16-bit version that make it my preferred choice. The original Oliver Twins NES version does have some pretty hard edges, like unexpected instant death traps and much trickier enemies like the spiders who move at random and so on. A fair amount of these have gone in the Mega Drive game, although that makes the game a bit less arbitrary and a lot fairer in the end. Fantastic Dizzy is an odd game. At the time that this 16-bit version came out in 1993, every other platformer had considerably more attitude than Dizzy did, to the point where this feels like quite the throwback, and yet it almost feels like a harbinger of things to come. What you have here is in many ways a 2D prototype of the open-world collectathon platformers that would become common in 3D in the PS1 era. You like games like Spyro or Banjo-Kazooie? Well, you'll probably like this too. By virtue of being such a throwback, it actually stands out quite well on the Mega Drive amongst the Sonics and all the Sonic imitators. And I'm not just emptily stripping bare my nostalgia for a silly little egg and its often flawed games when I say that Fantastic Dizzy is one of my favourite Mega Drive platformers. I think it's as good as the egg could have gotten in 16 bits. It does make you wonder how he actually would have done in 3D, if the attempt to make Dizzy 3D had actually come off. On the evidence of this, Dizzy may have done very well indeed. But details like that, as well as stories of many other games and a look at Codemasters' journey to general respectability, are all best saved for another, altogether bigger video. Bye for now! Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like the video then please do like it, leave a nice comment, have a look at my social media, and if you really like it, have a look at my Patreon. You could join this list of awesome people right here. Alexa Jones-Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Arcade LY Webmaster, Brian Henniger, Chris, Conrad Pritchard, D. Xalior, Roomworn Sutter, Dagorath Dungeon Keeper, Danny Wolfers, Dave Cook, David Rose, Dinty76538, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Geordie Alex, Glunfeth, J.S. Manchild, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Lukas Kaligowski, Matthias Gramzov, Michael Halliday, Mike Clayton Travis, Martin Pataki, Nate Milbank, Neem Kean, Potter Margel, Renbimon, Robert De Felice, Rusty Kelly, Sam Stoddart, Seth A. Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tarek Amir, Tim Wald, Tom Kay, Yerka Operator, and to all the rest of the community, thank you so much, and goodbye.